thank you for joining us. On behalf of the C Center and COS, thank you so much for coming out for this, I think, very important event. February 24th, earlier this week, marked 2 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And today the war rages on, and global support for Ukraine appears to be flagging. Western sanctions haven't worked to weaken Putin's power, and Ukraine's military is facing real shortages in ammunition and fighters as Russia appears willing to absorb major losses in troops and equipment. Over the next hour, we hope that you will learn a bit about the ongoing struggles of this war from a wonderful panel of DU faculty experts who will offer their own perspectives and expertise on the current conflict. Since folks on this panel are hopefully familiar to you, I won't read their full bios, but let me please just briefly introduce our amazing panelists. We have Olena Fomenko, who we are lucky to have at DU this year from Ukraine as a Fulbright Fellow, who is in the Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies. We also, from that department, have Nadia Kaneva, who is a professor in that Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies. And then we have 3 professors who will likely be familiar to those of you at the Korbel School: Rachel Epstein, Debak, and Suisheng Zhao, who will all speak about their respective expertise as it relates to this conflict. I've asked each of the panelists to give a few opening remarks, and then I'll follow up with some questions, and I'll also invite them to ask questions of each other before opening it up to all of you. Thank you again for being here with us. Let me also start by saying that I've asked Nadia to give us a little bit of an overview of where the war stands at this moment in time, and hopefully that will be helpful for folks who are catching up. So thanks, and over to you, Nadia.
Thanks, Marie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is a somber moment, I think, at least for me. And I would like to start by reading very briefly a very short email exchange that I had with Olena on February 24th, 2022. At the time, Olena was in Kyiv, and I was here in Denver. And we were professional colleagues, but we didn't know each other very well. And when the war broke out, I was feeling very emotional about it, being originally from that part of the world myself. I'm a native of Bulgaria. And so I reached out, literally didn't know what to say. So I just wrote this one-line email: Olena, words are meaningless. I hope you are safe, and I pray for an end to this. And she responded, "Dear Nadia, thank you so much for your message. Your support means a lot. It looks like there's no safe place to be in Ukraine right now. Some people tried to flee Kyiv in the morning, but the majority are staying here. We have shelters, and if necessary, spend the night in the closest one. Most people stay calm. We've been through so much already. I was more scared back in 2014 than I am now. I hope all this will be over soon. Best wishes." So I wanted to start with this because even though the title of the event is 2 years since the start of full-scale invasion, for Ukrainians, this war has been going on for 10 years, and we often tend to forget that from where we sit today. So as a way of kind of bringing us all to the present day, I just am going to read very quickly a truncated timeline of events to kind of remind you all where this started, how it started, and how we got to where we are today. So in 2014, in the winter of 2014, Ukraine was experiencing what has come to be known as the Revolution of Dignity, or better known in the Western world as the Maidan Revolution, and which resulted in violence, and ultimately the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych fled the country. And on February 20th, shortly after this was happening in the central square of Kyiv, Russian forces entered the Ukrainian territory for the first time. They were not wearing identifying marks, and for a long time the Russian government was denying that this was actually the Russian military, but it was later on confirmed that indeed it was. On March 18th of that year, 2014, Russian occupation authorities held referenda on the status of Crimea, the peninsula that subsequently was annexed by Russia unilaterally. That has not been recognized by the international community. Only 6 countries in the world have actually recognized Crimea as Russian territory. And then in April, on April 12, 2014, the Russian forces also held referenda on May 11, 2014, the Russian forces also held referenda to establish the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, which were occupied territory by the military of Russia. And fast forward to present day. So let me kind of summarize in the interest of time. So after all of this happened, kind of an ongoing conflict continued in the eastern part of Ukraine. There was some attention to it for a while. There were some sanctions implemented, but nothing really happened significantly in terms of Western intervention. And the conflict was pretty much treated as a civil war within Ukraine, even though it was initiated by the invasion of Russian forces. So fast forward to 2022, and we are again in the month of February, and from the 4th through the 20th of February, China is hosting the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Meanwhile, on the Russia-Ukraine border, Russian troops are amassing, and for a few weeks there was a lot of expectation that something might be going on. There were reports from intelligence released that, that Russia may be planning something. All of this is being denied, of course, by Russia. And as soon as the Olympics are over on February 20th, on February 21st of 22, Russia made an announcement recognizing the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. So here's our connection back to 2014. And then the next day, the Ukrainian parliament declared a nationwide state of emergency. And on February 24th at 5 in the morning, Russia attacked Ukraine, bombarding cities all over the country, including Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and Kiev regions. So all over the country, with forces trying to enter the territory of Ukraine from multiple directions. So we kind of probably remember the rest of the story a little better, but there have been different setbacks in Russia's attack, and ultimately where we are today is that the majority of the fighting is concentrated on the eastern border, but there continue to be multiple bombardments every day of the entire territory of Ukraine, including attacks on civilians and on civilian infrastructure. So as of right now, based on most recent statistics from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 6.5 million Ukrainians are refugees abroad, and 6 million of those are in Europe. And in addition to that, 3.7 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. So in a country of 40 million people, that's a very large proportion of their population that is in some kind of status of displacement. Also, according to UNHCR, there are 11,000 confirmed deaths of civilians. This is specifically civilian deaths. And additionally, 20,000 injured civilians. And of those, 587 were children who were killed, and 1,300 were children who were injured. Again, these are estimates, and they only concern civilians. So I think that brings us to present day, and we can come back to some of the other details and statistics and numbers, but this is where we are today.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I want to turn it over first to Olena to give us a view from the ground from Ukraine.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I would like to start with a poem. This poem is called Sirens. It's a very short poem. Air raid sirens across the country. It feels like everyone brought out for execution, but only one person gets targeted, usually the one at the edge. This time not you, all clear. The author of this English translation is Anatoly Kudryavitsky. The author of original text in Ukrainian was a poet, writer, and activist Victoria Amelina, who was killed by a Russian missile when she was in Kramatorsk, together with a delegation of journalists and writers from Colombia. They were at a regular place, at a pizza house, having pizza, having lunch. And ironically, she happened to be this person who is at the edge. Air raid sirens is something which unites all Ukrainians. We have them daily, and we experience them differently. We have them more often in some parts of Ukraine. Sometimes we hear them all over Ukraine. Even here, while I've been in safety for the past 5 years, I still have this air raid alert on my phone, and I follow all the alerts, and I read the news, and I see what's happening in the areas where my family is, and I always write them and try to find out if they're alive after each air raid siren. My task here is to talk about experiences of Ukrainians, and of course, experience of every single Ukrainian is different and unique. It depends on where you are, whether you are on the front line or at occupied area or in Kyiv or in the west, whether you live in city or village where you feel relatively safer, which is not always the truth, which is not always the case, because Russian missiles are flowing into Ukraine every single day and hitting people in different, even the remotest parts, closer to the border with Poland and everywhere, basically. And whenever we hear air raid alerts, all of us do different things. People like Victoria Amelina are close to the front line. They have just seconds sometimes, or half a minute or minute to hide, and very often they can't find shelter. It's not enough time to hide. People in Kyiv have learned to live with sirens. When I speak about shelter, actually there are no real bomb shelters in Ukraine. Our president and parliament definitely have very good bomb shelters. Some factories, plants built in the Soviet Union have bomb shelters. For most people, a bomb shelter is just a metro, which is the best shelter in Kyiv in particular. Many people hide in basements, which are not safe. If it's a direct avia bomb, you are not safe in such kind of shelter. Usually it's a parking lot or underground mall or something like that. Many people in Kyiv, especially when these attacks happen very often, especially they happen at night, they just put their kids to sleep in the bathrooms, in the bus stops, or there were long periods of time and everybody was basically living in their corridor. We had this funny meme which has a plan of an apartment with very tiny rooms, like living room, bedroom, study, bathroom, and a huge corridor. So like our life, we all moved to corridors close to front door where people feel relatively safer. And we all know, so we know this rule, the rule of two walls, where you're supposed to stay as far from windows as possible, ideally behind the two walls, because this is a chance to survive. Air raid alerts, shelters are words which have become part of our everyday vocabulary. It's a very strange feeling because these words used to be so these words we associate with Second World War and with Cold War. And we never thought that words like air raid alert or avia bomb or ballistic missile would become parts of our daily lexicons. Our children know these words. Our children know all different types of equipment, missiles. They can tell people, when people hear sounds, they know, especially people living close to the front line, they can tell whether it's incoming or outcoming, whether it's Russians or Ukrainians fighting. And we know how drones sound, we know how missiles sound, and it's very, very sad reality for Ukrainians. our language has changed, so these are not only the words which have become part of our daily lexicon, even usual questions, how are you okay, really, in reality they mean, are you alive? And when you ask these questions to people on the front line, they just put a plus, so we have plus. Plus has become like a kind of word or phrase or communication, sometimes the whole sentence, meaning I'm alive, I'm okay, I'm fine, just one more minute. And of course, during our experiences have changed during the 2 years. We have become stronger. We are still strong, but I believe during this year we started talking more openly about our feelings. We are not afraid to admit we are scared. People tried to protect their children in the first months of the invasion because they hoped it wouldn't last very long, so children can somehow stay kind of safer when they don't know what was happening. But now we are talking more about the war. We are talking about mental health, which Ukrainian government has launched mental health public communication campaign. And Ukrainians have, many Ukrainians had just to put aside their regular lives. Many writers, activists stopped writing books. They became volunteers, and many people changed their lives completely. Of course, the experience on occupation areas is quite different. I have a relative who had no choice but to take Russian passport, and recently she started working at high school teaching biology because she needs money, she needs to survive. So people on occupied areas are waiting for liberation, but at some areas they've been waiting for 10 years already, and they're not still liberated 10 years later. Another one positive fact about Ukrainians is that during the past year we have read many more books. Book industry has been profitable, unlike many other industries, because people are trying to find refuge, and we read a lot of books. We couldn't read at first, and many people still can't read fiction, but we can, because reality is so much stronger. We don't need fiction, but we do read books. And and of course every day every single Ukrainian we thank our military forces, because thanks to them we are still alive. When I asked my friend who is at the front line, what do you want me to tell to Americans at this event I'll be speaking, he told me just, we are very tired, we lack ammunition, we lack missiles, we lack basically everything. Russians have many, many times more, but we will fight and we will stay strong and we will fight with whatever we have. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Olena, truly. Thank you for grounding us in the humanness of this story and the experiences that people are having in Ukraine, and also reminding us too about the kind of creativity and resilience that people are, finding in these moments. And I love this thought about the number of books people are reading as a real reminder of the way in which this shapes humans' whole existence in life. I want to take a step and shift towards our next speaker, Rachel Epstein, who is going to help us put this war into the broader conversation around the EU and around NATO in particular. So Rachel, thank you so much.
Thanks, Marie, and thanks everybody for being here. It's a somber anniversary. It's incredibly upsetting. Olena, thank you for being here, and I can imagine it's extremely upsetting for you. And so we're grateful for your presence. I also want to thank Nadia for setting up the panel. Sorry, try to gather myself. What I want to talk about is a little bit to do with NATO and the EU, their perspectives on Ukrainian accession to those organizations and what their role has been. I think there's a paradox in the conflict for Russia's aims in the following sense, and some of you would have read about this in recent days in the press. What we know is that Russia invaded on a full-scale basis in 2022, but as Nadia pointed out, the aggression actually started in 2014, mostly, in my view, because Russia would have a very hard time tolerating a democratic and Western-oriented Ukraine on its frontier. And the reason for that is because democratic movements in the proximity of an authoritarian regime like Putin's regime are a threat to Putin's ability to continue to stay in power and govern. We know a lot as social scientists about diffusion effects, and those are powerful in this region, which is also why we saw the crushing of the Belarusian opposition movement just a few years before. Right, so in a sense, what we think Putin was aiming to do was to make Ukraine a supplicant country with a puppet regime, much like that of Belarus. And ostensibly, if you're going to prevent Ukraine from becoming a Western-oriented country, you would not want it in the EU, and you also certainly wouldn't want it in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So those were the main objectives, I think, of the Russian invasion. And of course, what's happened in the meantime is that those larger geopolitical aims have been scuttled from a Russian point of view, in the sense that NATO now has 2 more members. The direct border between Russia and NATO, of course, is now much longer. It's more than 800 miles between Finland and Russia. NATO is spending more on its defense. It's more solidaristic. It's much more European focused than it was even a few years ago. So in that sense, it doesn't look like Russia's aims with respect to undermining the alliance or dividing it have been effective. Of course, also when it comes to the European Union, Nadia mentioned the fact that there was considerable violence and an ousting of President Yanukovych in 2014 in Ukraine. The impetus for that was actually that Yanukovych, the year before, was poised to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which would have been the beginning of a process of Ukrainian regulatory and market harmonization with the EU in the service of much stronger trade and other kinds of relations between the EU and Ukraine. At the last minute, Yanukovych declined to sign the association agreement at the end of 2013, we think because of very direct financial pressure and coercion from Russia. That association agreement ultimately was signed, partly because Yanukovych was ousted, right? So when we're looking back at the origins of the crisis, we should understand it in terms of Ukraine over a very long period of time now, trying to establish its democratic sovereignty and volition in international politics. And I think the West's argument vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine has always been what we're doing and what we're fighting about in this war is the right for countries to exercise democratic sovereignty, which has been a principle very much embodied by the international institutions, the EU and NATO, since the end of the Cold War. A very welcome transformation in European politics and in a way in global politics. I don't know how much time I have left. I think the last thing I would say with respect to Ukrainian prospects for accession to these organizations, you probably know that very recently Ukraine, with a number of other countries, has embarked on EU accession negotiations, right? This is a very exciting and monumental development in European and international politics. I have to be a little bit circumspect, though, because, of course, Turkey has been in the same state since the 1970s, right? So this is not an immediate move towards Ukrainian membership in the EU. We are hopeful that the EU, in this instance, given the moral exigencies at stake, will move faster. And a number of scholars around the world, including in North America, are actively working on the EU to look at this particular enlargement in ethical and moral terms in order to elicit a different, more generous, more accommodating approach for Ukrainian accession to the EU. So that's underway. That's a very positive development, though not one I think that we'll see fruition in the next 5 years. I doubt it. On the NATO front, I think also it's important to go back again to what Nadia said about the aggression that was instigated in eastern Ukraine by Russia starting in 2014. Since that time, Ukrainian integration with NATO has actually been ongoing, increasingly deep, and foundational. And that integration continues, right? So Ukraine doesn't have immediate membership prospects in NATO either, but 3 new positions have been created at NATO headquarters in Brussels, in the Defense Planning Department. Right? The Ukrainians are there. They are not just observers. They are actively engaged in NATO defense planning. And this is in the service, again, of the alliance trying to help Ukraine defeat Russia on the battleground, but also in the longer term to ensure interoperability and to develop Ukraine's capacity to defend itself in the long term. If, you know, there's cessation to the current conflict, that it continued to be able to defend itself. So that political process is very well underway, and I anticipate that there's going to be continuing support and growing support for Ukrainian membership in the alliance. I'll stop there and hope that elicited enough questions for later.
I think that's terrific and such a helpful way of situating where we're at now in a broader set of institutional and historical processes. So thank you so much, Rachel. Nadia, I'd like to turn to you next to bring your expertise on global public opinion and thinking about this war in terms of a kind of a broader suite of conversations right around public opinion. So thanks so much.
Thank you. So I had printed out a few statistics from recent global public opinion polls to share with you and conveniently left them on my printer. So you'll just have to trust me. Well, let me first say that in the Western world, public opinion is something that we almost fetishize, I would say. We believe that public opinion is what drives politics, and therefore we care about what the public thinks, feels, does, and therefore we also follow polls and surveys all the time. So maybe it's for the best that I didn't bring these with me. That is not the case all over the world. So when we think about global public opinion, we have to recognize that and acknowledge that whatever is reported to us as public opinion is not just a reflection of what people think, but it also can be manipulated, can be shaped, can be framed, can be controlled in various times with various measures, some more violent than others. So with that said, though, there is fairly clear mapping of where the world stands in relation to the war, continuing war in Ukraine. And it appears that the world has kind of divided into at least two camps, but possibly three. And the Western camp is the one that goes along with a lot of the policies that Rachel was talking about and tends to frame this conflict in terms of a fight for democracy and freedom. That particular framing doesn't resonate equally well in other parts of the world. And so we can see that in the way that countries in the global south have been responding to the conflict, some of them actively supporting Russia and others kind of remaining neutral or abstaining from major votes in the United Nations, for example, and trying not to take a side. So beyond that kind of macro picture, there are also differences within these larger categories. So for instance, in Europe, public opinion is generally on the side of Ukraine, meaning that most Europeans say that they want Ukraine to win. At the same time, a very small number of Europeans believe that Ukraine can actually win. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. So they want Russia to lose, but they also are not really willing to be super heroic and stand with Ukraine when it takes real sacrifice. So that is something that European leaders will have to deal with if they want to continue to support Ukraine and to mobilize their countries and their populations to support those policies. In the US, public opinion is very clearly now starting to split between the two major political parties. Democrats are still very much in support of sending more military aid to Ukraine, whereas Republicans' opinion has dramatically changed. So off the top of my head, a month after the start of the full-scale invasion, only 9% of Republicans polled were saying that the US should not be sending military aid to Ukraine. Within the course of a year, that went up to 40%, and now I think most recent data show that it's closer to 49%. So very clearly, the war has been, quote unquote, politicized in the US context, and it's being now part of these inter-party fights, especially coming up to the presidential election in November. With all of that said, I just want to kind of wrap up, and then we can go into more detail later by saying that there are kind of three main themes that I see as somebody who studies media and public opinion that will be challenges for Ukraine going forward in terms of conveying its message to the world and seeking continued international support. One of them is that we have moved beyond the point of kind of immediate solidarity based on just human empathy, and now all countries are looking at this through the lens of their national interests. And how those national interests are defined varies quite a bit, even within the EU, where, you know, in theory, the EU is acting as one actor providing aid, but individual members have very different understanding of their national interests. Secondly, I would reiterate the point that framing this as a fight for democracy and freedom is not going to be a winning argument all around the world. And Ukraine recognizes that, and they've actually been doing a lot of diplomatic work behind the scenes. For example, on February 24th this year, one of the vice foreign ministers for Ukraine was in India talking to diplomats there and trying to build a bilateral relationship to get India to be supportive of Ukraine. So that will be something that, a message that will have to probably be adapted. And third, and that was raised in a study by a European think tank that tracks public opinion, it appears that at the present moment, there's a lot of interest in the world to bring peace, but how peace is defined will be kind of the turning point. And it's possible that many people will define making concessions to Russia in order to cease hostilities as peace. But the challenge for Ukraine would be to explain that that is not a lasting and durable peace and define peace in a way that's relevant to the global community at large. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nadia. I think that is a tremendously helpful overview of these different patterns, and I feel like I could listen to you talk about the details and the nuances for the whole time that we have. So I hope we have some more questions about those topics and trends. Let me turn now to Debak Das, who is going to share a little bit about the increasingly, I think, increasing awareness and worry around the issue of nuclear weapons as they relate to this war, and perhaps also some other insights from your own research and expertise.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the C Center for having me on this panel. It's, of course, 2 years and a really sober moment. So let me turn to the nuclear aspect of this conflict. And at the beginning, let's just take stock of where Russia is with its nuclear weapons, right? So Russia, as of summer 2023, had an estimated stockpile of about 4,489 nuclear warheads for use on both strategic and tactical weapons. Now, about 1,197 of those are for ICBMs, so long-range strategic nuclear weapons, and 896 on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, 590 on bombers, and 1,816 on a wide range of non-strategic weapons, so short-range tactical nuclear weapons. Now, only 1,674 of these are actually deployed, and the rest are stockpiled in storage. Now, with that picture of the fact that they have almost equal levels of nuclear weapons with the United States, let's talk a little bit about where Russian nuclear doctrine is. Now, before this current conflict started, of course, it's been going on since 2014, but in 2020, Russia released this document of its nuclear doctrine, and it said that it had made a few changes, and it highlighted 4 things in this particular doctrine. First was that Russia would conduct a nuclear retaliatory strike if it received reliable data about the launch of ballistic missiles against Russia or its allies. Pretty straightforward. Second, the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction against Russia or its allies. Third, attacks against Russian nuclear command, control, and communications infrastructure. And fourth is aggression against Russia with conventional weapons that threaten the very existence of the Russian state. Now, this was new. And there is and has been questions about what does threatens the very existence of the Russian state mean? By Putin's wording and recent Russian reports, do they consider Ukraine also to be part of the Russian state? If they do, and if that's the vantage point from which they're looking at things, then does attacks on Ukraine or the West supporting Ukraine, does that threaten the very existence of the Russian state, right? So these are broader questions. Now, with that, I'll speak about four main issues. One is the threat of nuclear use and nuclear deterrence, right? So we've heard lots of threats from Putin through the last 2 years about the potential use of nuclear weapons. We had worries in early 2023 that there might be some sort of demonstrative nuclear strike, which would be aimed at deterring the West from actually aiding Ukraine. By and large, this has been rhetorical. It has been a lot of posturing. When the Russians said that crossing a red line would be if the United States gave longer range missiles to Ukraine. That was a very clear red line, right? To my mind, some of these red lines that are being drawn by the Russians is essentially signaling to the NATO states as well as the United States that, hey, there is a limit to the kinds of weapon systems that you're allowed to give Ukraine. And I have no doubt that that is actually moderating a lot of the conversations in Washington, D.C. about the types of weapon systems that are going to be given to Ukraine. Now, how that will fare out with the potential sale of F-16s to Ukraine, it's yet to be seen. But do we expect longer range missiles to be given to Ukraine from the United States or NATO? I think not. So to that extent, these threats of nuclear use may not be immediately tactical in terms of the battlefield in Ukraine, but there is a broader, longer strategic game that the Russians are playing, and they're aimed more towards the United States and NATO than anything else. That said, just a quick note that, within this, there was the conversation about the transfer of nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, which was a very obvious and threatening move by Russia. Not illegal according to the NPT, because the Russians remained in control of those nuclear weapons, even though they were on Belarusian territory. But by and large, I think we should also expect to see signals like this. And I'll come to a signal that came out essentially yesterday in a second. The second point that I want to make is, despite all of these threats of nuclear use, we've actually seen restraint in the sense that we've not seen the use of nuclear weapons. And there are two potential explanations for this, right? One is that there is a nuclear taboo, and that taboo holds, right? There is a threshold that if states use nuclear weapons, that is a point of no return. It's extremely morally condemnable. We've not seen the use of nuclear weapons since the United States used it on Japan in 1945. So breaking that taboo is a big deal. And presumably someone like a Putin also realizes that, and the Russian state realizes that. I don't think they realize that because necessarily they're moral actors. I think they realize that because there is a broader international audience that is also looking at Russia at this moment. As Nadia pointed out, there's a broader global South community which has either stood basically on the fence, or has said, well, we're fine doing business with Russia, right? Because this is not our war. And I think if Russia does decide to use nuclear weapons, this entire global South community, communities and countries in Asia as well as Africa, Southeast Asia, will not conduct trade with Russia anymore. They will not stand by the wayside anymore. And I think the Russians realize that as well. So a lot of their sanctions busting is not going to work anymore because they will have used nuclear weapons and alienated a broader international audience. So an example of this is when last year, the Russians were talking a lot about the potential Ukrainian use of a dirty bomb. The Indian defense minister actually called up the Russian defense minister and said, any use of tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory is going to be unacceptable for us. So it goes to, it's a point which shows that, even if India is going to conduct all this trade with gas and military equipment, there are certain red lines for states in the global south as well. So that's an important point. Two other quick points. One is that the war in Ukraine has shown, for the nuclear world at least, that with artillery as well as rockets flying near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that civilian nuclear power plants are at risk. You might risk something like a Chernobyl or a Fukushima. This is something that I'm happy to elaborate on later on, but it's a major worry that we have. At the moment, the Zaporizhzhia power plant is essentially shut down. So the threat from that particular power plant is very low of it being attacked, but that's something that could always escalate. And third, the final thing is, if any of you read the Financial Times, yesterday there was a big report which came out talking about leaks about Russian nuclear, tactical nuclear usage plans. They had access to these strategic documents, and they've written up this big report. To my mind, these leaks are part of a broader strategy where the Russians have these leaks every now and then and threaten, hey, we might use tactical nuclear weapons, so restrain yourselves. But what's interesting is that in those tactical nuclear weapons use plans, China was also in there. They have plans for using tactical nuclear weapons in their fronts with China should there be a confrontation there. I think it speaks to a broader strategic sort of scenario, and I'd be curious to hear what Suisheng thinks of differences between China and Russia along territorial lines, and what he thinks of these sorts of plans being leaked as well. So with that, I'll end my comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Debak. I don't know that I'm going to be sleeping any better at night tonight after that, but I really appreciate all of that information. You set it up beautifully to turn to our wonderful colleague, Suisheng. So thank you so much for talking about where China fits into this whole conversation.
Thank you, Marie, for sponsoring this event, also Nadia for organizing this wonderful panel. My role is talking about China's role here. China is a player, but I will argue that China is a very awkward and uncomfortable player. In fact, Nadia mentioned that on February 4th, 2022, when the Winter Olympic opening ceremony started, Putin was in Beijing and signed a very strong language statement with Xi Jinping, stating that the partnership between Russia and China is no limit, and the cooperation is no restricted areas. 20 days after the war started, and that set background for China-Russia relationship. And after war started, China never condemned Russia and also adopted Russia's narrative that NATO expansion pushed Russia to the corner. And that was why Russia launched the war. Why China took that position? From Chinese perspective, they saw the whole international power relationship in a very clear balance power, strategic balance perspective, because China, Russia, and US are big powers, great powers in their mind. And China relationship with the United States has been deteriorated. And they see the US is going to contain China's rise, or do whatever to prevent China from rising as a peer power. And in that context, they see the relationship with Russia as a counterbalancing behavior. In fact, China has organized what I use the term anti-hegemonic coalition of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. in confrontation with American alliance systems such as the Quad in Asia Pacific, US, Japan, Australia, and India, and AUKUS, the US, UK, and Australia. Now New Zealand is going to join. So this kind of power distribution from Chinese perspective is very important for China to line Russia together with China in this kind of power competition. However, after the war dragged on, I think China's position began to, I will not say change, China had to rethink its position because China has been condemned by the West, by NATO, by Europe, by Japan, by other countries. And China support Russia has been seen as a partner of aggressor, which is not good for China. Not only about that, economically, China also suffered because of sanctions against Russia. China also have some kind of damage because the Chinese company is doing a lot of business with Russia. For example, last October, US Department of Commerce put 42 Chinese companies into sanctions because they're involved with Russian companies. And last month, in fact, this month, I would think, US Congress is putting some kind of sanction bill. European Union has done that week before, tried to put sanctions of Chinese companies. Other than all those kind of complicated economic and strategic issues, I want to also talk about China's relationship with Ukraine. Although China does not want to offend Russia, but I don't think China is in a good position to offend Ukraine because Ukraine has a very long time, has been long-time partner of China. In fact, remember, China first aircraft carrier was purchased from Ukraine. And China had a lot of sophisticated military weapons purchased. I mean, those Soviet designed and very sophisticated weapons purchased from Ukraine at a very fraction type of price of Russian would sell to China, including the missile technology, the jet engine, a lot of things. On a trade relationship between China, in 2019, China became the largest trade partner of Ukraine. And Ukraine is a big grain exporter. China imported more than 1/4 of Ukraine grain, and also corn and a lot of those kind of products. Even after the war started, China still imports a lot of Ukraine's, I think a 1/4 of Ukraine grain still shipped to China through those corridors now. And also the sunflowers, a lot of agricultural products still shipped to China. I would say between 1/4 and 30%. And China and Ukraine signed 2013 they call friendship, joint friendship and cooperation treaty to elevate their partnership into a strategic partnership. And China also joined the US, UK, and other countries to provide guarantee for Ukraine to delinquish its nuclear weapons. So in this kind of, it's very awkward for China in the relationship with Ukraine, because Russian invasion is a clear violation of China's foreign policy cornerstone of respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity. So in that context, you can see the second year, China's position began to change. They try to sit on the fence, try to say, we want to promote peace talks. Even they offered to mediate. In fact, China is in a good position to, if they really want to mediate, because China is lifeline of Russia at this time. All those Russian energy also is export to China, and so many things China could do. But China is not neutral. mediator so far. Because they have never, even in this process, they have tried to continue their support to Russia and have not really done anything in truly neutral position. Why China has not not done that? It's also very simple. Similar to what they start this position, because they don't want to see Russia to be defeated. Because in that case, China would confront the United States alone, which is not in China's interests. And also, they have, when we talk about China-Russia relationship, they have a lot of diverse interests and historical animosities. Now their relationship between the junior partner and senior partner is very complicated from China's position. So if Russia is defeated, all those kind of problems would occur to damage China's position. And China also benefits now getting all those cheap oil, all those things from Russia. So China has offered its neutral position, but I don't think China is a true neutral mediator yet.
That is so helpful and I think incredibly enriching to the conversation to think beyond kind of so what is so often at the focus of our coverage here in the US or kind of from a NATO and Western European perspective. I just think this has been so rich, and we have a lot of knowledge on this panel, and I want to make sure they answer questions that all of you have. So I'd like to turn it directly to audience questions given the time and invite you to think about what you would like to ask all or any specific one of our panelists. I'd like to collect the questions, depending on how many we have potentially in groups, and just to remind you and to ask you to keep your questions very short and to the point so that we can make sure we get through as many of them as possible. We will pass around a microphone, if I can grab one of these, yeah. And go ahead and just raise your hand if you have a question. Let's take two at a time to start.
Going back to what you said about China and the partnership that it formed with Russia prior to the invasion, and China's nebulous position, would China have done that if, did they not calculate for Biden and Zelensky and their determination when they came up with the partnership? Does that make sense? Okay.
Great. This other question right back here.
I'd like the panel to comment on any ideas about how they could disrupt India's purchase of oil from Russia.
Thank you so much.
Let me start from
Perfect.
her question. I think Chinese president was surprised, caught by surprise by the heroism of Ukraine people to resist, and also the military, the myth of the break of the myth of the Russian military power, just like Putin himself. So he at very first did not want to talk to Ukraine, although they had all those kind of treaty obligations, did not do that. But after all this process, last year, I think in April, when President Xi Jinping visited Russia, he came back, had a phone conversation with Ukraine President Zelensky, and I think the conversation was going well, but he waited half a year to talk to Ukraine. And so I think China was not prepared for the whole long process, but they are happy to see this kind of dragged war because it's in its interests to see Russia to be involved. America is diverted the attention from East Asia, from China. It's just like September 11. And that really diverted American and West attention to China. China got a great opportunity to focus on its economic development, to rise to be a big power. So I think that's the point. Energy, you want?
Yeah, I think that's a great, wonderful response. Would anyone else like to jump in on the question of India's? I'm looking at you, Debak, so.
No, happy to.
Sorry.
No, not at all. I do work on Indian foreign policy. So I think the question about oil sales in India has to be rooted in a broader context of trying to understand where is India coming from, right? And I think that there are many policymakers in Washington who still don't entirely understand where India is coming from. It's not just about oil sales, right? So India has taken a position here which is entirely interest-oriented. Now, you might say, well, wasn't that non-alignment? To be fair, the Indian government now talks about multi-alignment, right? Which is to say that it's happy doing business with the United States when it comes to trying to check China in the Quad and in the Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, it has a long-standing relationship with Russia on military arms sales, as well as all sorts of other critical mineral as well as oil sales, right? So then the question is, can the United States and its allies actually sell oil to India at a discounted rate, the same kinds of discounted rates that the Russians offered to sell them? But even if they did, that wouldn't wean India away from its relationship with Russia. Russia has been supportive of India at many different occasions in the UN Security Council with its vetoes when the United States and the Western countries have not, right? So the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar summed this up, saying pretty early on in the war that Europe's wars are not our wars. We will continue to conduct business with Russia as well as the United States and the Western allies as we see fit. Because ultimately, the Indians do not necessarily see the United States and the West acting from a necessarily principled position of caring about human rights and civilian lives, right? And the recent Raisina dialogue, for example, shows this very clearly. You have the United States and Western NATO folks wanting to talk about Ukraine, whereas questions about Israel and the United States' support to Israel and attacks on civilians and loss of lives of children and women in Gaza, not talked about at all. So the Indians, as well as other countries in the global south, do not necessarily see the West as being a principal actor here. They see them acting in their strategic interests. And to them, then the question is, well, why shouldn't we act in our own strategic interests?
That's incredibly important and powerful, and I'm so glad you brought that into this conversation today. Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. Great. Let's take 3 at a time. So we'll get all of our panelists a chance to comment.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the subject of nuclear weapons since 1/5 of the panel discussed this. Taboo is what you talked about, and let's assume it's taboo to the Americans and the Russians, but I'm afraid we have to divert to what I think are loose cannons around the world. And maybe Russia is as well. I'd love for you to comment on that, because there's some of us sitting in this audience in great fear. I'm of the age where we had drop drills when I was a kid, and some other people in this room remember that as well. So, you know, that fear sticks in our head for a long time.
Thank you. We have a couple questions over here as well I want to make sure we get to, and then we'll come back to you.
Hi, thank you all so much for speaking today. It's been really informative and I'm learning a lot. I was hoping that some of you can speak a little bit on the current ICJ case that's going on, specifically about how Russia used in the beginning of the invasion the idea of a Ukrainian genocide as justification. and also now specifically with the kidnapping of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children, if we should be calling this a Russian genocide, and if there should be an ICJ case to specifically be looking into that, and what that would mean kind of for public opinion, both in the Western European world and the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, my question is a little more broadly targeted. So both jokingly and seriously, people refer to Ukraine as a combat lab, wherein we are drawing lessons on technologies and tactics that are being that are being utilized in this theater that are unique, given the point in time where you are and the opportunity for people to be creative in how they conduct offense and defense. Keeping this in mind, what are some of the implications for international conventions on war and things of that nature, law of war, law of armed conflict, Geneva Conventions, and other things that govern conduct in armed conflict, set to change as a result of what we see going on in Ukraine today?
Three fantastic questions. I want to open it up. I'm not sure we have all the necessary kind of answers for all of your questions, but based on who's on the panel, but let's give it a try. Would anyone like to jump in and start?
Yes, and so in terms of the question of loose cannons that are not in the United States or in Russia, I'll just say, look, I think that the nuclear taboo holds across all countries. We seem to have this expectation or assumption that the United States and Russia's nuclear weapons, fairly safe, have proper command and control procedures and other countries don't. I don't think that's right. I don't see India or Pakistan's command and control being not intact. I don't see any country that has nuclear weapons not ensuring the safeguarding and safety as well as security of their weapon systems as well as enriched uranium and plutonium. So on that question, I am not particularly concerned about other countries or actors in countries that are not US or Russia, at least in the context of the Ukraine war, especially. So no concerns there. Very quickly to John's very wide-ranging question. That could be like an entire 10-week course. Thank you for that idea. But I'll just say very quickly that on the conventional war front, I think the use of drones, the use of cheap drones, especially by Ukraine, has changed many ideas about how a conventional war might be fought between states. That said, when it comes to questions about broader laws of war and Geneva Conventions, I mean, I'm not sure that this war has necessarily has strengthened any norm in favor of that. If anything, it's broken those norms. And I think other countries are also continue to break those norms because some of these norms are not, some of these issues are actually not going up to the ICJ and being prosecuted, right? So with that.
Let me jump in very quick on the implications for wars in other areas. In fact, the wall, a possible wall across Taiwan Strait is a scenario which when the invasion started, people were talking about. Because I still remember a lot of people in China, when they started the war, they said, Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Because they thought the Russians could crash Ukraine just in days, if not just weeks, or if not days. But they were surprised. They were surprised by how strong resistance a smaller and weaker nation could assemble against a much more powerful nation, and how a superior military force like Russia could even not achieve its military objective easily. So that will give Chinese leaders a second thought about if they are going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. if they should be much, much better prepared if they are going to take that action. So I would argue that the Ukraine war has at least gave the world or international community more time to meet another this type of crisis. I don't think it's in U.S. interest to get involved in Middle East and also Europe than in Asia.
About Russia's narratives. One of there are many narratives, and my feeling is that they are created for internal Russian audience, because people outside Russia, they know what's going on. Russia used several pretexts. One of them to invade Ukraine. One of them was that it was preventive measure, otherwise Ukraine would invade Russia if Russia wouldn't have done it first, which is ridiculous. Another one was that back in 2014, Nazi gained power in Ukraine and Nazified Ukraine, and they came to Ukraine to liberate people from regular, ordinary people from Nazi. And if you wonder who a Nazi is, it would be somebody like me who wants to speak Ukrainian, to display Ukrainian flag if they want, and to join any organization and just to be free and in our country. And this is what a typical Nazi looks according to Russians. For 8 years, they've been promoting that myth that inside Russia, of course, because people outside Russia know what's going on, that Ukraine was bombarding Donbass for 8 years, which is also ridiculous because Donetsk was intact. Back 2 years ago, it was intact. So there were some fights going on back in 2014, 2015, but then the whole city, and we all know how cities look like after Russia or after bombardments by Russia or no matter what. We all know how Bakhmut looks like, Avdiivka looks like, Mariupol, what happened to them after when cities are really bombarded. Of course, it's a myth, and paradoxical and very strange thing for us in Ukraine is that Russians religiously believe this propaganda. I would like to recommend a documentary which came out recently. I haven't seen it yet. It's called Intercepted. The whole documentary consists of telephone talks between Russian soldiers and their families in Russia. So the whole documentary, it was presented at Berlinale Film Festival a week or two weeks ago. It consists completely, it shows, the picture they show images and videos from Ukraine. They show what's going on in Ukraine, what's really going on. And the whole documentary consists of these intercepted talks. And you can see this strange picture of the world when relatives, families, parents, wives of soldiers are even saying more ridiculous things than their family, than soldiers are doing. For example, there are talks like, I'll become inhuman, I'm killing, I saw a woman with 2 children and I killed her in front of her children, and a mom or wife would say, don't worry, they are not people, they are Nazi, they're not people. And so this is something I would like to watch myself. I don't know where it's available yet, but I highly recommend this documentary, which received some award at Berlinale Film Festival. Thank you.
I wanted to comment briefly on the last 2 questions, and with the caveat that I'm not at all an expert on military law or human rights law. But from the point of view of public opinion, I think the various war crimes and abuses that Russia is has committed and continues to commit, will have to be brought to justice in one way or another. The question for me is who will have the moral authority to do that in a way that's credible to the world and not just to certain parts of the world. And the International Court in The Hague, for better or worse, is still kind of seen as a Western-centric institution. And for example, as you know, the US is now being accused of enabling genocide by Israel in Gaza. And so we can't really look at these conflicts in isolation from each other. From some of the recent opinion polls here in the US, for example, it's interesting that both Democrats and Republicans right now consider the conflict in Gaza to be equally important to national interest as the conflict in Ukraine. However, there's no significant distinction between Democrats and Republicans on Israel-Hamas, whereas there is a significant distinction between Democrats and Republicans on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with Republicans kind of taking a pro-Russian position. So even domestically, there isn't a consensus about what the United States' role is as a peacemaker or guarantor of human rights in the world. So that really complicates the issue. That doesn't mean that it should not be addressed at some point, but it's difficult to see that the United States currently has the moral authority to lead on that. And to John's question, one thing that, I think would be really interesting, and if you do teach that class, let me know, maybe I'll audit. One thing that I think hasn't been addressed adequately and needs to be addressed going forward in terms of how military action is defined, controlled, regulated, is the participation of non-state and non-military actors. And what I have in mind here are technological platforms, such as the various social media platforms that we all use, who can enable or disable certain type of information and also help in spreading disinformation. But also the role of individuals, very wealthy individuals who control some of these platforms and control some of the technologies that allow drones, for example, to be used effectively or not to be used effectively. And they are not, as non-state actors, they're not bound by the same rules, and yet they could be, in some cases, even more instrumental in the way war is conducted. And for me, that's an area that's really troubling and rather difficult to kind of apprehend how we will ever control that in any way as an international community.
Thank you so much. Let's take a couple last questions and then give our panelists a final chance to respond. Let's do one, and then I see in the back 2, and then far back 3. So sorry. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this panel and this discussion. I am the Fulbright Scholar Campus Liaison here at DU, and just want to, again, warmly welcome Olena to the University of Denver. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you here. And so thank you so much for sharing the Ukrainian perspective on the conflict. And going with that, we've been hearing a lot about the geopolitics. And I'm curious, Olena, if you can share with us, of course, I know you can't talk about the Ukrainian sentiment in general, but from what you know, I'm curious to hear, what do the Ukrainian people think of kind of the geopolitics and the support or lack thereof of the war and the Ukrainian people?
Thank you so much. Go to the back here.
Hello, thank you so much for this panel. I have a question mostly about the implications of the rise of the far right in Europe with Le Front National in France, as well as the rise of the AfD, although I guess it's a little fractured in Germany, and that implications for the EU stance on Ukraine. And then also we have an upcoming presidential election here in the US. So if we could just get some insight, like maybe more on the political sense of the implications of all that. Thank you.
In the very far back, our last question.
Okay, do you think Trump is directly and significantly responsible for the Republican response to Putin's actions? And secondly, I saw one little blip on the news, I think it was yesterday, that or maybe 2 days ago, that Alexei Navalny was just about to be swapped before his death, and I have heard nothing else about that.
Great, thank you. So is Trump responsible for the Republican response to Ukraine in the US? And we actually haven't talked about Navalny Yeah, so thank you so much for bringing that up, and a very important set of events and tragedy in the last week and a half. Olena, let me turn it to you first, and then what I'll do is just invite Rachel and then anyone else who'd like to make any final comments to share. Thanks.
Lisa, thank you for your question. I'm really honored to be here and with this wonderful community. To answer your question, I think today, right now, we are feeling the same way we felt exactly 2 years ago when we felt on our own, we felt abandoned, like the whole world has just abandoned us, and especially during the very first several days of the full-scale invasion, even our government wasn't seen that much anywhere, so people felt we were on our own. We started forming those local communities, territorial defense. People would actually, they gave out weapons in the street. Anybody could show their passport in Kyiv and get a weapon and rifle to protect yourself. During the first year of full-scale invasion, we felt this incredible support of the whole world, and we believed that we were going to win. We felt like there were several times, several points when we could win had we had more support, more weapons. If we were able to fight on Russian territory, at least to target their military plants, their airdromes where they park their military planes. So, but we are not allowed. We are not allowed to do that. And some people even used this metaphor. They called what's going on in Ukraine is safari, because Russians know we are not going to affect them. They can come. We're not going to attack them. They can come to Ukraine and kill civilians and military men, and we are not going to fight back because we should keep this war inside Ukraine only. And but right now we are feeling a little bit demoralized and a little bit down because we feel like the world has given up on us. Some people say that probably it looks like the West is preparing to meet Russia in Poland or Lithuania or Latvia. So we feel like we can feel this lack of support, and we wish there was more support for Ukraine. Thank you for your question.
Thanks for the question on right-wing parties in Europe. I'll try to answer this briefly, but again, it's a long and complicated story. But essentially, the theory of the international institutions that I was talking about earlier, both NATO and the EU, is that those institutions have transformed European politics such that extreme right-wing parties don't wield the same sort of dominant influence that they have previously in Europe. So there was the first Secretary General of NATO said the purpose of the alliance is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And what that means, it's a metaphor, but essentially what it meant at the time and what I think it still means is that NATO is partly about the collective defense of the members and coming to each other's defense if one is attacked, which is Article 5. But the other really critical thing that the alliance has done is to tamp down regional rivalries in Europe itself. So the transformation, for example, of the French-German relationship is an outgrowth, I think, of both the role that NATO has played and that the European Union has played. So the people who support those institutions' work and enlargement partly think about the larger, longer historical context in which those institutions have had a massively placating Pacific role in general. Debak's point notwithstanding that, it doesn't look like these countries are often principled actors, absolutely true. When it comes to organizing European security and politics, however, we do think that those institutions and our support and engagement in them has really had a huge role in undermining AfD, National Front, et cetera. I will say also about the German case in particular, there's a whole debate now about how much NATO members are spending on defense. And it's an important debate, and I am kind of persuaded that the Europeans need to spend more on their defense. On the other hand, if we compare now to the 1930s, with the Americans begging Germany to spend more on defense, that is evidence of how transformational the institutional architecture has been. Germany would not be as transformed as it is as a country, as a power, as a military power, were it not, I think, for its membership in NATO and the European Union. To the question about whether Trump is exercising undue influence on the Republican Party in the United States, yes, I think that's true. I think the Republicans Trump, first among them, know that if they hand Biden this victory and allow the United States to provide another $60 billion in defense assistance, that's going to be a hard thing for the Republicans to contend with in the upcoming election. So I think it is a very cynical and destructive political impulse that is being led by Donald Trump.
I want to follow up on that. What Rachel is just saying is also very clearly borne out in the polling data that there's a significant difference in pro-Trump Republicans and how they feel about continuing to support Ukraine and provide military aid versus more moderate Republicans. And it has in no way hamstrung the Republican Party, which we see. On the question about Navalny, I have no way of confirming or denying whether he was indeed going to be swapped the day before he died. But thank you for bringing his name up, if for no other reason, because it allows me to say a couple of words about Russia and the Russian opposition, which has been under significant duress since the start of the war. And at the same time has remained quite ineffective even outside of Russia in terms of taking a stance on the war. And unfortunately, we continue to see that after Navalny's death, that there is kind of a galvanizing effect among the Russian opposition, but it seems to be very much focused on their own idea of what Russia is or should be and how to get there, and not so much being said about the aggression in Ukraine. There is another oppositional figure, though, that we don't hear much about, but who might be someone worth mentioning and remembering, and that's Boris Nemtsov, who was killed 9 years ago on February 20th, who was also a significant figure in the Russian opposition, who was much more proactively involved with Ukraine's fight to become a democratic country, and was in fact an informal advisor to President Yushchenko after the Revolution of Dignity. And unfortunately, he was one of the first prominent figures to be killed.
Thank you, Nadia. We are out of time, so if I just can ask for very short wrap-up comments from both of you. Thank you so much.
So I'll just say that I think we're at a situation now where the reason also you see waning support in the international community is because from the initial shock of what happened in Ukraine, it's now becoming more of a chronic condition, a condition of a more protracted war. And I think Ukraine's problem essentially is that the Western countries that are supporting it are now being seen, at least in the global South, as being broadly morally bankrupt, right? So how can Ukraine break out of that cycle and make its case, more salient to the broader international audience and community to help it through this crisis? And that's a difficult one. I have no answer of how that could happen, but I think that's an important step that needs to happen at some point. Thanks.
Just one sentence here. We should have a realistic expectation for the end of the war. How to define a peace here? Can we just completely defeat Russia, which I don't know, because that's historically 1905 Russia was defeated by Japan, regime change. 1917 Russia was defeated by Germany, then regime change. And 1980s, Russia lost war in Afghanistan, regime change. So is that realistic? We'll see a regime change in Russia, which I think if that's the expectation, I don't know if we can end the war peacefully.
Thank you. I want to give the very last word today to Olena, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. I just would like to give this little comment so that you have the right takeaway I'd like you to have. So despite lack of support and feeling somehow low, and we still have no doubts about our victory. This is exactly how, when I wrote Nadia that short email, I wrote email to another friend who offered me to move and come and stay in his house in Italy. I wrote, we are scared, but we are not. We have no doubts. We are going to win. We just know it. And it's a very strange feeling, but many Ukrainians were sharing that feeling 2 years ago. And we just know we are going to win because this is existential war, and in some way, in some form or another form, we've been fighting Russia for the past 300 years, and most of the time we were alone, we were on our own. So it's not something new for us, but the price is going to be very high. But despite that, we still have no doubt in our victory, because for us it's a question of life and death and existence of Ukraine, and that's what we believe. Thank you.